Hi, I'm Aaron Coleman. You're watching Western Bass TV.
Hi, this is Scott McKenzie, and you're watching Western Bass TV.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the International Sportsman's Expo, day 2 of our 4-day annual stop here in San Diego. For those of you gathered around our aquarium demonstration tank, the tank is brought in by thefishingschool.com out of Lake Fork, Texas. We bring the tank in, set it up, fill it full of water, and all the fish here are on display from the California Department of They get to hang out for a few days, listen to a few seminars, learn all of our tricks, and back to the Delta a little better educated once the show's over. For those of you gathered around the Safe Boating Aquarium Demo Tank, we want to remind you to wear your life jackets. For every 10 drowning on the water is an angler. Want to keep boating safe and have you wear your life jackets like Anthony is up on the tank. This guy up on the tank I've known for a long time. He used to run around behind his dad fishing tournaments. His dad's been a long-time tournament pro out of Modesto, and Anthony kind of has come into his own fishing a lot of the different tournaments, both the NorCal circuit, the Everscar tournament trail, a few of the BASS tournaments. Great young fisherman. He's grown up on the MotherLode lakes. He fishes Don Pedro, Maloney's, McClure, all of those lakes year in and year out. He knows what those fish do out there, and that's what he's here to talk to you about, a little bit about fishing the MotherLode lakes. Please welcome my buddy from Stratus Boats, Bob's Marine, Modesto, California's Anthony Pimentel.
Who here fishes any of those lakes that he just talked about? Don Pedro, McClure, Maloney's, a few people. What about Shasta or Oroville, places like that? Anybody fish those? A few people? Okay. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the lakes that I grew up on. And I'll tell you what, there's some awesome fisheries up in the areas that I'm from where there's some big fish. There's a lot of big fish and there's a lot of fish to be caught all the time. And I'm going to kind of give you some ideas of some ways to not only catch fish, but also how to find fish. And I think finding fish a lot of times is a lot tougher than actually catching them, because once you catch them, once you find them, you can always catch them. So I'm going to give you some ideas of how to find fish to catch them. And a couple of the baits that I always use on the MotherLode lakes to find fish. One of them is this right here. It's a jerkbait. And a lot of you have heard of jerkbait before. Up on our lakes, up in the Central Valley there, all the lakes have trout in them. So a couple of baits that I always look for, I throw first all the time, are trout type baits. As a matter of fact, swim baits are a big deal up there on the lakes right now. There was a tournament last week that 34 pounds for 5 fish, all with swim baits up on Don Pedro, and that's a great weight any time of the year. And this bait right here is actually a Smithwick trout pattern jerk bait, and it doesn't run quite as well when it doesn't have any hooks, that's for sure, but you can kind of see the action of it. All I do really is you kind of pop the tip of your rod, and it kind of sits there and it floats up real slowly. This is actually their suspender, and when the hooks are on there, it actually does suspend really well. And throwing a jerkbait, a lot of people talk about wanting to throw it. There's 2 ways to really throw a jerkbait, I think. This is a 6-inch version. It's a great bait this time of year, simply because a lot of times this time of year, the fish are a little slower. They're not actually moving real fast yet. The water isn't really warm, and it's a great bait to go actually to the points of a lot of these lakes and fish them. And there's 2 ways to throw a jerkbait, or at least 2 ways I throw a jerkbait. One of them is a slow retrieve, kind of like that. You get it down, and you slowly work it. And this is the way most people actually throw a jerkbait. Now, the way that I win money fishing tournaments on lakes is not doing that. Catch a lot of little fish doing that. Sometimes you got to be a little bit different than what other people do. And with this Smithwick, right here is one of the greatest ways to throw it. You see how much faster it moves. These fish hit this bait because it's a reactionary bait. And they're going to hit it because they see it come by. I don't give them a lot of time to make a decision. A lot of times with these reaction baits, your whole goal is to not give a lot of decision time for a fish to decide whether he wants to eat it or not. What you want to do is fish it quickly, so they have to make an immediate decision. Am I going to go for it, or am I not going to go for it? And when you do that, you've got to make sure you have the right equipment. And one of the most important things is the rod you use to throw jerkbaits. See, this is a really limber rod. This is actually a 7-foot, this is a G Loomis rod, very limber. And as a matter of fact, it's part of their cranking series, and it's designed specifically for throwing a jerkbait. And this is the only rod I use a Corrado Super Free, so I can throw it really, really far. But one of the most important things, you see how quickly this bait moves through the water. As you're moving this bait through the water, a lot of times fish, when you're moving it fast, are not going to have a really good opportunity to actually eat it. Because it's moving so quick, they have to make such a quick decision, they're going to go after it really fast. And so a lot of times you actually don't hook them very well. Even though there's 3 hooks in this bait, I've seen many times where my heart's about ready to get broken in a tournament because this fish 4 or 5 pounds will jump 25 feet from the boat and just the bottom part of the little fatty part of the corner of their mouth is hooked with one of these baits. So you've got to be really nice when you're actually throwing this bait. After you set the hook, you want to make sure that they can fight and wear themselves out before you actually get them close to the boat. And having the right rod, giving it a lot of extra limber time so they can make that decision is super important. And so when this fish hits and I can feel him hit, I've got all this extra sweep before I actually set the hook into this fish. So this fish actually has a chance after the initial hit to grab it some more before I set the hook. So there's a better chance I'm actually going to have a better hookup with this bait. And this is actually one of my favorite baits, as I said, is this rainbow trout. I will tell you, I'm very, very simplistic when I fish, because if I have too many baits, I don't know which one to throw a lot of times. I throw this bait right here, and basically on the lakes, I'm going to throw, this is a 6-inch version. I don't think it really matters on the MotherLode lakes if you throw 6-inch baits or if you throw 4-inch jerk baits, because the fact of the matter is most of the fish that if a fish will eat a 12-inch swim bait, that little 6-inch bait right there is nothing more than a morsel for him. So this is the first bait. Now besides the rainbow trout pattern, the only other 2 patterns I really throw, one of them is a chartreuse type pattern. And I'm not going to show you the chartreuse as much as a rainbow trout with more of a chartreuse back to it. Now this one's actually a Lucky Craft Stacy right here. It goes a little bit deeper than the other bait, a little slower. And it's a great bait to throw on our lakes. The only other color I throw is a silver patterned, anything silver, something that's going to relate to a shad pattern type bait. Because the fact is I'm either fishing for trout, I'm either fishing looking like a trout, or I'm fishing looking like a shad. And so anything silver, whatever you like. I personally like Rapalas. I throw a lot of Rapalas. I throw a few Lucky Crafts, a lot of Smithwick. And you'll see the difference in the action. This bait's going to stay down there a little bit deeper, a little bit longer. This is one I actually throw this time of year. I throw that big 6-inch bait starting from March till all the way through the summer. You see this bait there, you can sit there and it'll suspend a little bit better. Gets a little bit deeper. And a lot of times the strike you are going to get on this bait is actually going to be on the rise itself. As it comes up, the fish want to follow it up and actually eat this bait. The later in the year, the bigger the bait I will throw on a jerk bait. And notice as it slowly comes up, fish are starting to move around a little bit more. Now this one I pop a lot slower because a lot of times these fish will eat this bait on the rise. So this bait, you get down really fast, let it move up, pop, pop, let it move up. You give them a chance to see it because it's always moving, all the time. Another one of my favorite baits. The other bait I use this time of year to catch a lot of fish is a spinner bait. This, by the way, I without a doubt can tell you, this and the jig are 2 of the baits I've caught more big fish on than anything. This is actually a 3/4 ounce spinner bait this time of year. This is what I throw, is 3/4 ounce spinner baits. I want to get a little bit deeper, and a lot of times people use smaller blades. I use 3 colors of spinner baits. White and chartreuse, and chartreuse. Those are the only 3 colors. Everything else I don't really focus on. I focus more on the type of blades that I use. And on a 3/4 ounce spinner baits, most of the time I use a number 5 willow leaf type blade. If it's clear skies, it's always silver. If it's overcast, it's always this copper color right here, the bronze. Those are the only two differences I make. In 3/4 ounce, I always use a big blade. And this time of year, they do something called slow rolling, which is really that's what you do right there. Is just slowly moving it across the bottom, real slow. And you're trying to hit every piece of wood, rock, any structure that you can find. And most of the time, you can't even feel the fish this time of year hit this bait, because they hit it so softly. The only thing that changes is the blades stop. And you swing into the swing in, and sure enough, there that fish is, because things are so cold. And so this is a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait. Bigger blades on the 3/4 ounce spinnerbait. I want it to go down 15, 20 feet, nice and slow. Again, with this, I will tell you, with a spinnerbait, the reason I like this bait a lot more than a jerkbait for tournament situations is simply because there's one hook, usually a 4 or 5/0 hook, and they cannot throw it like they can with that jerkbait. A lot of times you'll get your heart broken on a jerkbait. You'll lose a lot of fish. It's a great bait to find fish, but if I can catch them on a spinnerbait, I'm going to throw a spinnerbait any day of the week and twice on Sundays over any other bait, because when they eat it, they're coming in the boat. And I don't need to worry about a net most of the time. You can actually just swing the fish in. Now you can see the difference. This is a St. Croix 7-foot medium rod. You see the difference. This rod doesn't move or have as much bend by any stretch of the imagination as that other Loomis did. And that's because when they hit this bait, you want to hit them back. You want to let them know that you're on the other end of the rod. I always use 20-pound test line. Again, I use just a regular Corrado reel, and I'm just moving it real slow along the bottom. You can see how I don't really change it. It comes right over the top, and spinnerbaits most of the time are super weedless, so you can throw it right over the top of a lot of the different wood, stumps, rocks, and you don't really get hung up. Sometimes you do, but not very often. And a lot of times, the fish this time of year will hit it when it flutters over the top of a piece of wood. It'll come over and it'll flutter, and all of a sudden they'll eat it. As a matter of fact, the biggest fish I've ever caught on the MotherLode Lake was a 1080 on Lake McClure, which is relatively known as a spot lake, and it was caught on this exact spinnerbait right here, doing this exact style of fishing in late February. And it came over the top of a piece of wood, and I thought I was hung up. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm hung up, and then it took off. And I said, I'm not hung up anymore. So the spinnerbait by far, for me, is the best option. Now, what do you do differently? The only thing I do differently is sometimes I will throw smaller blades on my spinnerbait. Now, with this spinnerbait right here at 3/4 ounce, I can throw a heavy blade, it'll get down deep. Smaller blades a lot of times are thrown on lakes when you're trying to get it down very deep. And on some of our lakes, if you want to get it down deep, if I want to fish this 30 or 40 feet deep, I can do it. I just downsize the size of my blades from 5s to 3s. That's all I'll do. Is simply just downsize the blade just a little bit. As things warm up, starting about March, when they start thinking about coming up, and the water temperature hits, there's a water temperature mark of 58 degrees. And when the water temperature hits 58 degrees, a lot of times that's the time of the year that you can take your heavier baits off, like your 3/4 ounce spinner baits, and you can downsize. When it hits 58 till about 65 degrees, I switch over to a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait. Again, this is a white and chartreuse spinnerbait with, again, a gold willow leaf blade. One of my staples. I was on Lake Comanche about 3 weeks ago and had a 5-pound muley and a 6-pound largemouth bass on this bait right here. And it was a lot of fun too. It was middle of January. The water temperature was super cold and they were eating. It was the only day the sun had come out. And it was sunny and cloudy, and then all of a sudden the clouds came back in. I put on that white and chartreuse from the white spinnerbait, and it made all the difference in the world. So you'll notice this spinnerbait, when I crank it the same, it doesn't come down anywhere near as close to the bottom. This is something that you use later on in the year. You can use it in the summertime. And this is when fish are more active, when they're willing to make a run at it at a quicker time. They don't need to see the bait as much. You don't need to hit the wood, because as soon as it hits 58 degrees, those fish will become a little more active, and they'll see it come by a piece of wood 4 or 5 feet above it, and they'll look at it and they'll think about coming off of whatever structure that they're on, and they'll try to actually hit the bait. So spinnerbait is probably in my arsenal number 2. The number 2 bait that I throw up on the MotherLode lakes. The number 1 bait, I have no problem telling you, I may fish a lot of MotherLode lakes and they're super clear, but a jig, this is my number 1 bait to throw on any of the MotherLode lakes. And this right here is actually a 1/2 ounce football head. I throw 3/4 or 1/2 ounce. I never go lighter than that. And this rod I use actually is a 7-foot heavy. So this rod doesn't move very much at all. 20-pound line, left-handed Corrado reel. And this is really my go-to bait. There's actually a Yamamoto twin tail grub on there right now. And the thing that makes this bait such an awesome bait to use is I want to make as much noise as possible with this bait. I want to kick up, obviously on the lake bottoms there's sediment everywhere. And I learned this years ago on Lake Comanche when the fishing camera came out. I went and fished a point on Lake Comanche and I fished it for an hour and a half and did not get a bite. And I was like, I know these fish have got to be here. Why aren't they eating? And I dropped that fish camera down to the bottom and there were about 40 fish sitting right there that wouldn't eat. And all of a sudden that camera hit the bottom and it kicked up some sediment. 4 or 5 of those fish came over and one of them actually tried to eat the camera head. And I was like, wow. So I put on a 3/4 ounce jig, Yamamoto just like this. This is a watermelon red and black flake. And I threw it out there and the first hop off the bottom and it kicked up some sediment. The rod almost got ripped out of my hand. And fish after fish after fish. And that's what makes this bait such a great bait. I can also fish this bait around wood and rocks. And most bass are going to eat this bait right next to their home. And fish all have homes. Just like we have a home that we go to, the fish home is anything that's different on the bottom of the lake. So wood is a great example. This time of year I look for lay-down trees in the water where the sun actually warms them up in the afternoon. The muddy banks. Fish love crawdads. This is their favorite, one of their favorite baits is a crawdad. They'll eat a crawdad over a shad any day of the week. It's a bigger bait. There's more to it. Hey, look at that. You see, they have a lot of interest in this crawdad. They didn't have much interest in going after any of those other baits. You can also just drop that bait right down wherever you want. And this is the only way I fish this bait one of 2 ways. One of the ways I fish is I hop it. This is what I do most of the time is I throw it up, a couple feet of water. Sometimes you get a strike as soon as you set the hook, so you've got to be ready. You have to have your rod tipped down when you're fishing this bait. I always have my thumb and my index finger on the line because sometimes they hit it and you can't actually see them hit it, but you can feel them hit it. And when they hit it, there are times when they'll hit this lure and you'll see your line start to run right up where they already hit the line and you're already reeling down to set the hook as fast as you can. A couple times it's off of one hop. By the time you're in 10, 15 feet of water, they've made their decision. And this is a bait I fish extremely fast this time of year on our lakes. On any of the lakes, including Oroville, Shasta, lakes like that, I fish this bait extremely fast so you can move down the bank. You can cover a lot of water. This one right here is, as I said, is watermelon red and black flake. It's great for largemouth bass, and there are a lot of largemouth in this tank. They all came from the Delta, so there aren't any spotted bass like you see on a lot of the MotherLode lakes. The other option, and the one I use for spots all the time, is downsize just a little bit and use what they call a 221, which is cinnamon with purple and black flake. Little smaller bait. Now notice they all have 2 tails on them. That's so it looks and imitates a crawdad. And if you notice those fish down at the other end of the tank when you saw them want to come after the bait, as soon as you hop the bait, those tails are freaking out. They look for action, and a lot of times these fish make decisions based on the kind of action that the bait makes. So this is a 221. And you see them just kind of hopping the bait, moving it relatively quickly, and you'll know when you get a bite. Now, there's another important thing when you use this bait. Why do I use such heavy line and a heavy rod? Because most big fish are lost on jigs. I will tell you that that is the number 1 bait to get big bites. It's the number 1 bait to lose a good fish on, because people don't understand that when you're throwing a jig, you cannot set on the fish like you set on it with a worm. A worm you can just kind of pull up and they'll be there. A jig, especially big fish, What they do is they try to kill a crawdad before they eat it, because a crawdad's not just going to go right down its throat. They're going to want to actually try to fight, obviously, to live. So when you get a big bass, they actually have crushers in the back of their throat, and these fish will come and they will take that crawdad and suck it down, and they're going to sit in their crusher and try to crush it so that they can kill it before they actually eat it. Well, when you've got a 7, 8, 9, 10-pound black bass, well, it's in its crusher, its mouth is 2 inches above its crusher. And the mouth of a big black bass has the bone on the top of its nose is as big as your pinky. And if you've got to get that half-ounce head out of its crusher through its lip to hook this fish, you have to actually set the hook extremely hard. That's why it's so important to use big line. It's easy to break big fish off. It's also easy to lose your life jacket as you're going. Now see, I'm not moving that bait. Those fish are down there having a bird's eye view. Notice I'm using that football head. Do you see how that bait is sitting up? A lot of times as you hop it, it sits up right on its tails. And its tails are sitting up in a defensive position, just like a crawdad. Because crawdads get defensive when they're going to get eaten. And so they're going to try to fight, and that defensive position is what makes bass think that it's a crawdad. And all of a sudden, when you pop it away from it, they see that it's trying to get away. And so as it's trying to get away, they're going to try to eat it. The other way to throw this bait is to drag the bait across the bottom. And this is if you don't get them hopping it. They'll always try hopping the bait first. When you drag the bait, now you're never going to notice it quite in a tank because it's not a lot of sediment. You'll actually dig up dirt. And these crawdads, right about now, they're going to start coming out. They're going to start coming out of their holes. They go dormant when it gets really cold. And when you drag that bait, that's what a crawdad does a lot of times. A crawdad doesn't hop. You don't want to jiggle this bait, okay? Okay, you don't want to jiggle this bait, because when you jiggle the bait, okay, crawdads don't sit on the bottom and go, hey, here I am, eat me please, eat me. Crawdads, a lot of times, they will sit there and be as slow, as silent, as stealthy as possible. I've actually seen crawdads lay on pieces of wood, and a bass comes by, and he just moves to one side or the other side of the piece of wood, whatever opposite side that bass is coming up on. And so, as you take that bait, now I like to do a sweeping motion like this, real slow. Obviously in the tank you can't do that. Just dragging it straight down. As you drag that bait, a lot of times they'll kick up that sediment to make those fish want to eat. And you notice I'm not getting hung up a whole lot. This has a weed guard on it, so as you have that weed guard, it actually keeps you from getting hung up as much as you would if you didn't have that weed guard. And so slowly dragging the bait across the bottom. This is one of the things I'm going to be doing this week at Lake Oroville. There's a tournament, and I'll be dragging this jig right here across the bottom. This exact jig, as a matter of fact. This is a great bait for spotted bass. Spotted bass really like to eat this bait. Just ask any of the people that fish a lot. A lot of the professionals here know that bait very well. They have a lot of them because they had to pay for them. Now, a lot of you, who here's heard about drop shot? A lot of heard about drop shotting? The new craze out on the West Coast. Now it's taking the nation. This is one of the baits that really has changed bass fishing in the last few years. I will tell you that I was one of the last people that would be willing to change, because drop shotting can catch you a lot of fish, but it also sometimes doesn't catch you the size. But if you want to catch a lot of fish, it's a great bait to use. I usually use a 6.6 rod. This is a 6.6 rod, relatively light. This has 8-pound test. A lot of times I'll even use 6, all right, pound test. Okay, the drag's got to be really loose on this when you use this bait. This is the way I throw this bait a lot of times. I want to find out, this bait I use to see which kind of bait the fish are actually eating. Are they eating crawdads or are they eating shad? And so if you notice, I'm actually putting something called a double drop on here. I have my weight on the bottom. I have a crawdad type worm on the bottom. This is a Keeper custom worm. And on the top, I also have the bottom bait rigged Texas style, so if I'm around a bunch of wood, I can fish wood and not get hung up. which is a great thing to be able to do. On the top bait, I've got more of a shad type bait. Now, a couple years ago on Lake Maloney's, I was fishing for a boat, and I took second place because of this bait setup right here. I would actually find bushes that were about 2 or 3 feet tall off the bottom with my depth finder. I would set this top hook up about 2 feet above the bush and let this bottom hook go right into the bush. I'd never get hung up, and a lot of times they'd eat that top bait that was sitting right over the top of the bush as you were shaking that bait. They'd come out and they'd grab it, and all of a sudden your rod will just load up. And you'd set the hook and you reel right away from there. But reel them right away from the bush as quickly as you can with 6-pound test line. So this bait most of the time is used as an up and down bait. I also like throwing this bait out. If I'm really needing some fish or I'm not catching very many fish, this is a bait that I'll go to relatively quickly. And all you do with this bait you want to shake a lot. You want to get some movement out of the bait. So you see, just like that. See, he ate that shad bait that was on the top. That would tell me something. If I caught 4 or 5 fish on a shad bait, that would tell me a lot about what baits I need to throw. It would let me know if I caught a lot of fish on a shad bait, I may throw a spinner bait. I may throw that jerk bait that you saw earlier to see if I can catch a bigger fish. But I'm always going to try to stay with the baits that they like the most. Yes? I catch a lot of big fish on the other bait I'm going to show you. I just, for some reason, biggest fish I've ever caught is about 5 pounds on a drop shot bait. No, there's not a very good reason. I just personally don't catch that many big fish. It's a great limit filler. Now, I do throw this on the Delta. I'm not really talking about the Delta. I will flip this bait on the Delta with a Cinco and drop shot and catch a lot of big fish doing that, but not in this scenario right here. You see, it is a way, though, that these fish become really active. And this is called finesse fishing. And what happens is these fish in this tank have gotten a lot of pressure the last day and a half from people like me trying to show you how to catch fish. And so when they get all this pressure, they don't want to eat. All of you are staring at them. They don't want to eat with you around. All right? That's like if everyone was here at your house watching you eat breakfast. They don't want to do that. But when you throw something out there that's a little bait, sometimes it's exactly what you need to do to catch them. And I do this all the time. One of the things I look for on my depth finder, I read it a lot on the lakes. I want to see how high the shad is off the bottom. If the shad's 3 or 4 feet off the bottom, that's where I put the top hook. If it's 6 or 7 feet, I'll put that top hook 6 or 7 feet. I'll put it at whatever level it is, because that's a lot of times where your feeding fish are going to be. Most of the time this bait is used straight up and down. You're right over the top of the boat, and you'll go just like this. You'll just drop it right over the side by your trolling motor, drop it straight down. Always kind of I use a light line approach. You notice I don't have any tension on the line because I want to be able to pop it. Like so. I keep the rod always in a position where I can set the hook. One of the worst things you can ever do is have your rod tip way up here while you're fishing, because you can fall asleep real easily and not catch them. So always keep your rod tip in a position where you can always set the hook very easily. So this right here is a bait that I get really excited about when I need a fish. I've done it many times where this bait right here has saved me in a tournament because I've caught a couple of fish that really mattered. And all you do is really shake it. This is an old style of fishing called shake and bait. Shaking and reeling, shaking and reeling. Don't ever stop your reel from moving if you want to move it down the bait really quickly. Now, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to kind of give it up here. My favorite bait to put on the top is a Cinco. Wacky style. My hook will not take a Cinco, I don't think, so I'm not going to put it on there. But a shad pattern Cinco, wacky style, like so. If I'm fishing 40 or 50 feet, how many fish at 40 or 50 feet see a Cinco? Probably not very many. But I can take this bait and I can just antagonize fish with it until they want to eat. This bait is a fun bait. This bait right here is how you catch bigger fish on this drop shot. Bigger fish, bigger bait. This is one of the ways that you can do it. Drop shot and a Cinco. As I said, I don't like to drop shot. My father, who also has been fishing for years, loves to do it. And so one day I was out there and I said, you know what, I'm tired of throwing these little weenie worms and catching 1 pound spotted bass. I put a Cinco on there, and amazingly enough, I caught a largemouth. Then I caught another black, and another largemouth, and another largemouth, and caught fish after fish after fish just by drop shotting a Cinco. Now when I use a drop shotting a Cinco, I always use a 1/0 octopus hook. You do not want to use a light wire hook, because if you do, you will lose fish. Because it's such a thick bait, you cannot use the same style of hook that you would use when you're using smaller baits, like the smaller 4-inch curl tail keeper custom worm that I'm using down there. I grew up on this next bait. And this is one of the reasons that it took me so long to be able to do drop shot. And that's shaking a dart head. This bait has been around for years and years and years. Some people are pretty good at it, some people aren't. And you can shake any style plastic worm with a dart head. This right here is a 1/4 ounce dart head with a 1/0 hook. I throw this with all 6-inch worms. This is a 6-inch keeper custom worm. If I'm throwing a 4-inch worm, I throw a size 1 dart head, 1/4 ounce. If I'm throwing a grub or a tube, I have a 2/0 hook in here. And this bait right here I use on a 6-foot rod. Rod is very important for this bait. Smaller rod, 6 to 8 pound test line. You've got to have some give to the rod, all right? And this bait right here is a bait you can catch a lot of good fish on our lakes. I actually catch a lot of good spotted bass fishing lakes like Lake McClure, Maloney's, Oroville. And this bait, you notice the tail of it's always moving. This is a bait that you can move down the bank relatively quickly, shake it as you go. It's considered a finesse bait, even though it's a 6-inch worm. Now, one of the big keys with this bait is just like a jig. Whenever I find a piece of wood, a big rock, I'm not just going to pull it over the top of that structure and leave it alone. That structure's there for a reason. Imagine if that red carpet behind you on either side was your home and you were a bass, and all of a sudden the only thing on that red carpet was one big stump. Well, one of the things you probably notice is, where do these fish pile up? They pile up on something different in this tank, just like they do on our lakes. They pile up, they look for anything that's different. So, the way I catch most of my really nice fish is actually trying to get it hung up. Finding something, and as I'm coming up on a bush or something like that, and as I feel it, as I'm pulling it up on that branch and I know that I'm going to get hung up, just popping the bail and dropping it about 6 inches and just sitting there and letting it shake. And as you do that, a lot of times, that's where you'll get your bite. They'll actually pull it right back down off of that tree. This is a 1058. It's a great bait for McClure and Don Pedro. The other bait that I use is a shad pattern bait. And shad is what most of our fish are eating right now. When those, in March, I go to something that's not a shad pattern. I go to more of a green weenie type bait, something brown and green. It's either, with me, it's either clear, looks like a bait fish, or it's brown and green, looks like a crawdad. There's really no in between. There's a couple purples that look purples and browns, stuff like that, but there's always a brown in it. This is more of a shad style bait. This is one they really liked yesterday. Had lots of fish coming up on this bait yesterday. But fish are different each day, so you have to adjust to them. But this right here is called shaking and baking. And if you notice my rod, my handle, I continue to move the handle. Never stop it. I'm just continually moving it very, very slowly. And the rod is continually being moved up and down, up and down. Uh-oh. And sometimes you get hung up with this bait. Yep. And that's when you call in for an assist. You're supposed to catch a fish more, Tony. But if you notice as this bait hits the bottom, the tail of the worm wants to sit up. And that's what you want it to do. You want it to sit up like this at about a 45-degree angle as you're shaking it. Now the other thing, when you're fishing structure with it, you can just sit there on the structure when you find that bait and just sit there and shake it. Don't move it at all. It's called dead stick in the bait. Dead stick in the bait is probably the most boring way to ever fish. But when you find that piece of structure, if you're not catching any fish at all, one of the best ways to catch a fish is be where the fish are. And sitting there around whatever the bait is, and fish, stop. Shake, stop. And just sit there and let it sit. Let it lie. Don't move the bait at all. Also, if you have a lake that you fish that has standing timber, one of the funnest things to do with a dart head is to come up right next to that standing timber and look on your meter. A lot of times you'll be able to see where the difference is, if there's any bait or any fish in that, and count it off. Take your hand, just go right there and go 1, 2, 3. Count it down to the level that you see the fish, and start shaking that bait at that level. And a lot of times the bigger fish, all of a sudden you just lose contact. You're like, where'd my worm go? And you reel up and he's there. Now, spotted bass on our lakes up in the Central Valley, they can be really finicky, especially if they've had a lot of pressure. Now, when our fish have a lot of pressure, they don't always take the bait. They're really good at hitting the bait and letting it go. Sometimes they actually play with the bait. Now, largemouth like we have in here that come out of the Delta, when they make a decision, a lot of times they're going to eat it. But I'm sure a lot of you have went there and you felt that bite and you went and reeled down to set the hook, and you set the hook and nothing was there. All right. Spotted bass will play with that bait sometimes to decide whether or not they want to truly take it in. And when they decide to take it in, sometimes the best way to do it is to do a reel set. You don't have to come down like you see on TV, those guys, you know, they show the pictures where they go, oh, and set the hook really hard and catch fish. When you're throwing this type of a bait, you don't need to do that. You can actually do either a reel set or just make a slight sweep. And of course, get hung up again because I'm doing it so slowly. That's always exciting. Of course, if you shake it enough, sometimes it comes off. Now, a bait that has also changed fishing, has changed fishing up in our lakes in the Central Valley, is this right here, a Cinco. Who here has ever thrown a Cinco before? It's about everybody, huh? Oh yeah, Cinco, Cinco, Cinco. I will tell you, in the lakes, wacky style in a Cinco is one of the best things you can do. And I always use another heavy rod, a 7-foot rod, 20-pound test line. I don't mess around. Matter of fact, the largest fish I've ever caught, black bass, was on a Cinco. It was a little over 13 pounds. It's amazing the size fish you'll catch. You'll catch everything from 5 inches to 5 pounds or better on a Cinco. Well, on our lakes, a lot of times people don't think about throwing a Cinco. They only throw it 0 to 5 feet. This is a bait that's really coming on as a bait that can be thrown a lot deeper. You can catch a lot more fish on it. And I will tell you right now, I'm not sponsored by Gary Yamamoto, but I guarantee you that I spend enough money for him to fish any tournament he'll ever want to fish off of the amount of money I spend on Cincos. And wacky style in the 5-inch Cinco is probably the best way to catch fish with a Cinco type bait on the lakes. And just kind of going like that. Obviously the tank's not very deep. Letting it go to the bottom, just popping the bait. And the fish look at the Cinco, and a lot of times they just get amazed by it and they decide to eat it. And the thing about a fish on a Cinco, a lot of times they engulf the bait, so you've got to be ready when they eat it. When I throw a Cinco, I always use Andre Moore's Reaction Lure Wacky Rig hook because it's got already on it a weed guard. And so by having the weed guard, you go ahead and you don't get hung up very often. I also do not hook the bait itself. I want to have as much action as possible. I have a number 6 O-ring on the bait itself. So by having that O-ring, one thing that happens is a lot of littler fish on a Senko, you probably all had it happen before, those of you who have thrown Senkos, a little 8-inch fish will come up and jump and throw your Senko. And all of a sudden, 4 or 5 times that happens in a day, you're going back down to the tackle store buying another bag of Yamamoto Senkos or 4 or 5 bags or whatever. All right? Well, when you have that number 6 O-ring on there, it's tight, but a lot of times you won't lose your bait. You'll be able to catch 5 or 6 fish, where a lot of times before that you were catching 1, 2 fish, and they weren't always good fish. And this is pretty much one of the best ways to throw a Senko, to just pop it. This is that brown with purple and black flake. This is more of a spot color bait, used a lot of times to catch spotted bass. Now when I'm going to go after some largemouth, I'm going to make a change. Now normally if you were using a hook, you'd lose that Senko right there. I just kept that Senko to use for another day. One of my favorite Senkos for the lake is actually one that's got a couple of different color flakes. It's green and purple. And I do this because spotted bass like green, largemouth bass like purple. So I'm making both types of fish happy with this bait. So you take the O-ring, you can get them at Delta Bait, you can get them just about any store. You can get O-rings. And kind of lick the bait a little bit so it slides up. And one of the things that will happen with your O-ring as you're pulling it up is you're going to actually tear the bait a little bit. And that makes the salt come to the surface. And some of the times I will actually take the bait and roll it in my hand like so to make it really salty. And I put the bait just about right in the center, which is where I put the O-ring. Now the other thing I do if I want to get this bait a little bit deeper, I take a nail. This is just a lead nail. You can buy them at just about any tackle store. You take your nail, cut it in 2, put one end in each side. Now this nail, I don't want to put any weight on the line itself because it's going to hinder the way the bait works, and it's also going to make it fall faster than I want. So you put one nail on each end, or half of the nail on each end of the bait. And I put it in just far enough so that each end of the bait is covered so that you can't see the nail. You don't want it falling out. So you take your hook, you hook it back on there. Now watch how much faster this bait will drop. Bait drops a lot faster than before. So if you want to fish this bait in 25, 30 feet of water, that's how you do it. As a matter of fact, a tournament was won on Lake Shasta doing exactly this right here at Bassmasters. The amateur division was won throwing a bait just like this with nails in each end, dropping it down to about 30 feet of water. And sometimes you can just let the bait sit on the bottom and just pop the bait. Bait works totally different when you do that. And again, you can let it sit in a bush, and a lot of times you're going to get that bite on the fall itself. It's not going to be before, it's not going to be after. Always make sure that you're ready for a bite as soon as it hits the water. I'm always ready with the Senko, popping the bait. Hopping it up and down continuously. It's a bait I'm not going to throw right on the bottom. Now I'm going to always throw it next to any bushes, any trees, any rocks. You can fish this bait super deep if you want. And it's all about the hopping motion. Try different ways to throw it. I always, first of all, try to hop it real fast. Sometimes I'll let it sit on the bottom. Most of the time they're gonna eat it on the fall. So as it falls, they're gonna eat this bait. And this is a green pumpkin with green and purple flakes, a newer color. I have basically, when it comes to Senkos, I have either shad color Senkos or crawdad color Senkos. This is a Reaction Lures Innovation hook. They have them over right behind me at Coyote Bait and Tackle. I use a 2/0, 3/0, or 4/0 hook. I use a 4/0 hook on the Delta a lot. This is a bait, by the way, not to talk too much about the Delta because Tony's going to come up and talk about it, but you can get this bait down to 10, 12 feet by putting those nails in there and catching a lot of fish that other people don't catch, because they're fishing a lot shallower than you are. So if you have any questions, I'll be right down here by the tank. Feel free to come up and ask me any questions. I'll also be over at the Stratus booth next 4 days. Thank you very much. Have a great time at the show.